Hi there, neighbor. It's good to be with you again. There we are. How are you today, television neighbor? Oh, I'm just fine, and here we are, neighbors again. I've got something I'd like to show you. And then the show would be off. He'd pull out a different object at the beginning of each episode. It'd be a music box, a fireman's helmet, a mandolin, a bottle of perfume, all kinds of stuff. And from there, you would get on the trolley and go to the neighborhood of make-believe. And well, now I should pause, because if you were a child or raising children in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, you already know about the shoes and the sweater and the song and the show. But if you're not sure what all this was about, don't worry. I haven't gone mad from hunger yet. That'll be in Torah study this afternoon. No, let me introduce, or perhaps reintroduce, one of, as far as I'm concerned, the most important, the most influential Americans of the 20th century, Fred Rogers and his show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. From East Coast TV beginnings in 1962, a national debut in '68, and from there, over 30 years of consistent, high-quality, engaging, educational, and fun television for children. A staggering 912 episodes. Mr. Rogers, his show, his philosophy of child education deeply affected millions and millions of American children across social, religious, racial, and ethnic divides. He was our friend. He was our other parent. He was our teacher. He was our mentor. He was our rabbi. And not just for kids, but for parents who depended on him to help them talk to children about scary and difficult situations and topics. This year is Mr. Rogers' 50th anniversary of the show. And if you loved that show yourself, or if you saw the documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, which you must watch if you haven't, then you already know about Mr. Rogers. That he was the same person on the street that we would meet each evening in the cozy living room that existed inside our television sets. Fred Rogers was a musician, he was a composer, a Presbyterian minister, a teacher, a listener, trained in child psychology, a gifted public speaker, a writer, but more than anything else, Mr. Rogers was a mensch. He was a pretty young mensch, in fact, in 1953, when halfway through seminary, he saw the state of children's television, thought that it was terrible, reinforcing all the wrong things, so he decided to make a show. He had no idea that he was starting a program that would become Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and define 2 generations of Americans. If you grew up with the show and remember it, or saw the documentary, as I said, then you know how special it is in a way that I can't capture in a brief introduction. And if you never saw it, the most that I can hope to recreate is just a small taste of the magic that it really held. The show would open up with that iconic song, Won't You Be My Neighbor? And Mr. Rogers would bring you in and invite you into his living room. He was so connected that you really felt like you were there with him. Invited, safe, a place where you were welcome, a place where you were wanted. How good does it feel to be in a place like that? How good would it feel for us to make another person feel like that? Now you can start to see where I'm going to go with this. So Mr. Rogers would then have these random objects, and they would be like a wooden block, or sometimes something exotic, and this is completely true, like a shofar. No matter what, the object would come with a great story, and often a guest. The guest could be a special guest, like the famed American cellist Yo-Yo Ma, or a regular favorite, like Officer Clemens, who was an African-American police officer. Just think about that for a moment. A multi-racial, diverse TV show in the 60s for kids across America. That's a lesson right there. Officer Clemens was a safe, black police officer and friend to children of all races through the civil rights movement, through the Rodney King riots. He was a friend. And Clemens and Rogers were close friends on set and off set. And one of the reasons that Rogers put him on the show as a cop, which Clemens hadn't wanted to do, was because of the hostility that existed between African Americans and police. A hostility that Clemens himself, who grew up in Atlanta, said that he felt when he was a young black man growing up in his own neighborhood. How do you think Mr. Rogers would feel now? You can start to see another place that I'm going to go with this. But the real highlight of the show was when you got on the trolley, the neighborhood trolley, and it took you to the neighborhood of make-believe. And this was a fascinating place. It had a king and a queen, regular citizens that you would see each time, and everyone's favorite, Daniel the Tiger. All of them were puppets voiced by Mr. Rogers. He wanted it to be a place, and I'm quoting him, "When you felt worried or scared, the neighborhood would provide care, understanding, and safety." In other words, the neighborhood of make-believe was not a land of happily ever after. Every episode, in fact, involved different types of people, different points of view, and always at the center of the episode was conflict. The first season of local production in 62 and 63 had conflicts that ranged from getting a haircut and helping children feel less worried about the actual haircut and how they look, to the assassination of JFK. Mr. Rogers didn't guess about what he should put in his show. He simply took the things that children were concerned about, that children were asking about, and that is what he used. In the week following November 22nd of 1963, there were a lot of children. Some of you were those children asking, what does the word assassination mean? And there were a lot of parents who did not know how to answer. That clip, by the way, is in the documentary, and you can find it on YouTube, and it is astounding, and you should absolutely watch it. By the time the show goes national in 68, it was covering children's topics, like racial tension, the death of pets, divorce, bullying, the Vietnam War, feeling like you were a mistake. Sometimes he would spend a whole week on just one of those topics. And this was a kid's show. If you've never seen it, you may be picturing something pretty dark right now, but Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and the neighborhood of make-believe was anything but. It was a place of kindness, learning, love, inclusivity beyond its time. I mentioned the race part, but that was represented further in the makeup of the studio audience. Kids of different backgrounds sitting with each other, sometimes sitting with people that didn't look like them for the first time, and also children and guests on the show with special needs. The reason that Mr. Rogers would narrate what he would do as he walked around the living room was so that children who were blind could watch his show and follow along. He had guests on his show with physical and mental disabilities that there were not even polite words for yet. At this point, I've basically outlined half the social action agenda for the congregation, and I'm just describing a children's program. But before we leave the neighborhood of make-believe, I want to share with you one episode's plot. King Friday the 13th, who lived high up in his castle, was irritated with new people who were changing things in the neighborhood. He called them the Changers. And his response was to build a big wall to keep the Changers out of his castle. I'm not making this up. So the whole neighborhood sent balloons up to the castle, and each balloon had a note of kindness and peace, and eventually convinced the king to take down the wall and to welcome and include the Changers. The episode acknowledged that there would be change with new people, acknowledged that change is not easy, change is hard, but also taught us that at the end of the day, we are called on to be kind, welcoming, loving, even to new and different people that may, yes, change our neighborhood. By the way, Mr. Rogers, who wrote that episode and taught us to be inclusive and welcome and kind to the changers, was a lifelong Republican. And that plot is not some current situation or re-released episode, it's the pilot episode from 1968. So that, all of that, is Fred Rogers and his show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Now let me introduce to you Rabbi Rogers. Okay, so really he was a Presbyterian minister, Rogers, but he was the quintessential rabbi. He broadcast lessons of Jewish values to homes across America filled with things like B'Tselem Elohim. B'Tselem Elohim translates to in God's image, and it refers to Genesis chapter 1, when unlike all of the other animals, God created people in God's own image. But what B'Tselem Elohim really means in practice is that everyone is simultaneously special and equal. Rabbi Rogers would put it in his iconic quote, "I like you just the way you are." I can't convey what it felt like to have him look us children in the eye and say, "There's no one else in the world exactly like you. People can like you exactly the way you are." Too many of the kids who watched that show only ever heard that from Mr. Rogers. Another central Mr. Rogers value is ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha. From the book of Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. Aval, Rav Rogers hayu omer. The great sage Rabbi Rogers used to say, love your neighbor and yourself. In fact, Mr. Rogers has the greatest definition of love that I've ever heard. Love is not a state of perfect caring. It is an active noun, like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is, right here and now. Another core value of the show, an obvious one, is limidah, learning. But not only that learning itself is a value, but that it is worth being brave, showing some ometz lev, some courage when it comes to learning. Rabbi Rogers would tell us learning is the ability to accept and expect mistakes, to be able to deal with the disappointment that they bring. The Talmud puts it a little more bluntly, a fearful person cannot learn. Learning and growing from mistakes, that's what today, Yom Kippur, is all about. And speaking of Yom Kippur, Rabbi Rogers was all about slicha, forgiveness. The Talmud teaches whose mistakes does God forgive? Those of the person who is willing to forgive mistakes committed against themselves. Rabbi Rogers adds that forgiveness is a strange thing. It can be easier to forgive our enemies than our friends, and hardest of all, to forgive the people we love. Like all of life's most important coping skills, the ability to forgive and let go of resentments takes root very early in our lives. Vishinantam levanecha, and you shall teach them to your children. Thank you, Mr. Rogers, for teaching so many of us how to forgive. The last Jewish value that I'll mention that was a core part of his show, I can actually leave to Mr. Rogers' words alone. This is a direct quote from him when he returned to do a special episode following the terrorist attacks of September 11th in 2001. No matter what our particular job, we are called on to be tikkun olam, repairers of creation. Thank you for whatever you do, wherever you are, to bring joy and hope and faith and forgiveness and love to your neighbor and to yourself. Of course, you watch the show as a child and you can't label any of those values. Mr. Rogers didn't teach you ethics. He lived them. He showed us how to live them. He encouraged us not to know the values, but to do the values. As we say here at Temple Israel, Rabbi Rogers showed us how to be Torah. He was the mensch exemplar, and we can be that too. And while sometimes it's hard, most of the time it's easy. As a society, we may have just forgotten how. So this year, let's all live out some of those practical instructions from Rabbi Rogers and his neighborhood. First, let's be welcoming. Let's actually greet and accept and engage with other people, even if they're different from us, even if they believe different things than we do. Even God takes God's own notes from Mr. Rogers on this. Leviticus begins with the words, "And God called upon Moses and spoke to him." He's calling him right now. Could not have planned that one better. So it's true, even God wouldn't speak to Moses without first calling out to greet him. Actually greeting people with eye contact and attention makes a huge difference. If it's your friends and your family, or your doorman, or the cashier. Second, and now we're back to Yom Kippur, be a forgiving person. Yes, just as Mr. Rogers says, it is a lot harder to forgive our friends and loved ones than it is to forgive our enemies. But it is so important, so much so that we are taught that God only forgives those who forgives others. We spend a whole day just on this. Letting go is the only way to move forward, individually, as a family, as a community, and as a neighborhood. Last and most important, be a kind person. Yes, it's a catch-all category. Yes, it's completely cliche. But if there was one point that Mr. Rogers tried to make in over 40 years of television, or one point to this sermon, it's be a kind person. Be a mensch. That means that when we act, when we speak, we do so from a place of kindness. When a person engages someone with kindness, even if they give them nothing, it is as if that they gave that person every gift in the world. Pirkei Avot. There are 3 ways to ultimate success. The first way is to be kind. The second way is to be kind. The third way is to be kind. Rabbi Fred Rogers. I would love to end the sermon right here. I would love it if we all went out and did all of these things and lived by Rabbi Rogers' teachings, and that would be enough. But Judaism teaches us that it is not enough to simply do it ourselves. Yes, it's the golden rule, ve'ahavta livreacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. But we have to live by the rest of the quote from Leviticus as well. Love your neighbor as yourself, it says, but the verse right before that, you must surely rebuke your neighbor when they act wrongly. And it doesn't matter if we need to call out a neighbor acting unkindly right in front of us, or if we need to rebuke King Friday the 13th himself for trying to build a wall and keep out the changers. Remember that episode. The wall didn't come down because 1 or 2 people asked politely, or because an important person asked. It came down because everyone in the neighborhood of make-believe sent up balloon after balloon after balloon demanding Rabbi Rogers' values of gemilut chasadim, acts of love and kindness. So when you wake up in the world tomorrow and you see the news, or you look at Facebook, or you walk out and you see the streets of New York, don't think about that divided and broken world and say, oh man, what would Mr. Rogers do? Actually do what Mr. Rogers would want us to do and ask ourselves, what are we going to do? In cynical times, it's easy to write off everything that I've said. It's easy to believe that things won't change, and it's easy to toss aside cliches like be kind as something that will make a meaningful difference. But you know what the great sage Hillel said by this point, I hope, if not now, when? To be a friendly neighbor, to be a forgiving person, to be a kind mensch. That is what important. That is what is important. These behaviors have real, lasting impact, and you don't have to take my word for it. because Mr. Rogers can prove it to you right now. Almost every time that Fred Rogers spoke to an audience, he would have everyone in the room participate in this exercise that I invite all of you to participate in with me now. I think you'll agree that there's no better day to do what we're about to do than on Yom Kippur. Here's what Mr. Rogers would say. There are so many people that help us along the way. People who are extra special to us. Some of them are right here sitting next to us. Some of them are far away. Some of them, sadly, have passed away. No matter where they are, deep down, we always know they wanted what was best for us. They welcomed us with joy. They forgave us when we made mistakes. They treated us with love and kindness. Would you, along with me, take 1 minute and think of the people who helped you become the person that you are? The people who always cared about you beyond measure, who always encouraged you to be true to what is best in you. Just 1 minute. Picture their face. Picture their faces. And what it was that they meant to you and what you meant to them. I'll watch the time. Thank you. On page 318, infinite source of goodness, help us to see the good in ourselves, in others, and in the world around us. Teach us to cultivate a discerning mind, to know right from wrong, and a listening heart open to forgiveness. Guide us to walk in your ways with integrity, ever faithful to the promises our forebears made. And may your goodness inspire us to do what is just, what is right, and live by the teachings of Rabbi Rogers. Be kind.